Entertainment Weekly released a lot of stuff on Rings of Power Season 2 last week, or 2 weeks ago, however long ago it was at this point. And by now I've talked about a little bit of what they had, but in this particular video I'm going to focus on one particular aspect, or a couple of quotes that were made by the showrunners. And I think these couple of things that were said, I think they sum up pretty well a lot of what has infuriated me, what's infuriated a lot of Lord of the Rings fans out there, regarding how Amazon has approached adapting Tolkien's work, adapting Lord of the Rings or the world of Middle-earth, and what Amazon's attitude towards Tolkien is, what their attitude is towards Lord of the Rings, which is basically they do not respect Tolkien, they think they're better than Tolkien, they think they can take Tolkien's work, which is a literary masterpiece, and they think they can improve it, they think they can do better, and they're looking at Tolkien's work with this attitude of, it's ours now and we can do whatever we want with it. So I'm back to Entertainment Weekly. And this article, it is from August 6th, so we're talking a good couple weeks ago at this point. Rings of Power Season 2 will explore new aspects of Middle-earth. I'm not going to read the entire article, there's really just a couple of quotes I'm going to pull from this. To start off here, they say, Tolkien never explained the names or functions of the 7 dwarf rings, just that they were all lost by the time of Lord of the Rings. In Rings of Power Season 2, viewers will get to see them in action. Now I'm going to jump to thatparkplace.com. This article is from John Trent. That guy does a great job covering all this stuff. But it states here, Tolkien made it very clear how the rings affected the dwarves in the Silmarillion, and all those rings that he governed he perverted, the more easily since he had a part in their making, and they were accursed, and they betrayed in the end all those that used them. The dwarves had indeed proved tough and hard to frame, they ill endure the domination of others, and the thoughts of their hearts are hard to fathom, nor can they be turned to shadows. They used their rings only for the getting of wealth, but wrath and an overmastering greed of gold were kindled in their hearts, of which evil enough after came to the prophet of Sauron. And it continues, it is said that the foundation of each of the 7 hoards of the dwarf rings of old was a golden ring, but all those hoards long ago were plundered and the dragons devoured them. And of the 7 rings some were consumed in fire and some Sauron recovered. And he goes on, but here at Entertainment Weekly they incorrectly state that Tolkien never explained the function of the dwarf rings. And keep in mind, Entertainment Weekly, they are part of the Access Media. These studios, these people that are taking beloved IPs, beloved stories and corrupting them. Studios that are perverting classic stories, all in the name of updating them for modern audiences, turning them into platforms for their woke ideology and so on and so forth. Sites like Entertainment Weekly, people in the Access Media, they are going to kiss up to Amazon and other studios that are doing this sort of thing. But regarding the people working on Rings of Power, the issue here is they're looking for questions that Tolkien does not entirely answer, or rather they think Tolkien does not quite answer, and they're trying to come up with their own answers for him. They're looking for anything that's just a little bit open-ended, and then they take that and they try to inject their own ideas and do somebody else's work. But here's the biggest quote, where they say, the whole idea of doing a show in the Second Age was that it's not a fixed target. There's an enormous amount of room for creation and improv within a loose framework. The Dwarven Rings are a great example where it's like, what exactly did they do? How might that play on a father-son relationship? But in particular here, it's not a fixed target, the Second Age. There's an enormous amount of room for creation and improv within a loose framework. I'm going to go back a couple years to an article from Vanity Fair right before Season 1 came out. This was in February 2022. And this was just an inside look, but at one point one of the showrunners was quoted as saying, the driving question behind the production, can we come up with a novel Tolkien never wrote and do it as a mega event series that could only happen now? Can we come up with a novel Tolkien never wrote? I mean, talk about arrogance here. Number one, it's this mindset of we can do better than Tolkien, who's probably the greatest storyteller to ever live. And 2, it's an attitude that Lord of the Rings is ours now, and we can come up with our own story within somebody else's work, within somebody else's world. Let me remind you that Lord of the Rings already had a huge, huge fan base before this show came out. And when you're a fan of a certain story or a certain IP or a certain franchise, when someone's going to make an adaptation of that story, fans are going to want to see that story as it was written. They do not want to see you come up with terrible fan fiction and then slap that story name, that brand name onto it. And you could say that's essentially what Rings of Power is. It's terrible fan fiction written by people who aren't actually fans of Lord of the Rings, but it's a terribly written show with Lord of the Rings attached to it. And people in Hollywood, whenever they make statements like this, they always think that they're being extremely profound when in reality they're actually being extremely stupid. They think that they're intriguing fans with statements like this when in reality they're actually pissing those fans off. Lenny Henry, who played a Hobbit in Season 1, he was once quoted as saying, "We're telling the story now." Now when he made this quote, he was basically talking about how Rings of Power, it's diverse. We have black hobbits for the first time ever in the history of Lord of the Rings. This is historic and things like that. Any fans who think this makes zero sense are bigots, they're racists, and so on and so forth. And a couple videos ago I did talk about this topic, how diverse the Rings of Power cast is and why it's controversial, why fans are saying it doesn't make any sense. Which essentially what I said was, look, Lord of the Rings, it is rooted in European mythology, European folklore. Tolkien, when he was writing Lord of the Rings, he was trying to write it as a mythology for England because England's mythologies, they did not survive through the years like the Norse mythologies, the Greek mythologies, other mythologies of Europe. And one of the things I said in there was, if you made a story based on Japanese folklore, logically the people in there would be Japanese. You make a story based on Middle Eastern folklore, logically the people in there are going to be Middle Eastern. You make a story based on African folklore, logically the people in there are going to be African. And by the same logic, if you make a story based on European folklore, logically the people in there are going to be European. Which means, in the case of a story like Lord of the Rings, which is based on European folklore, European mythology, yeah, it's not quite going to reflect the world we live in today. It's going to be a bunch of white people in it. The people who disagree with this will say, I don't get what your problem is, this is a fantasy show. You'll accept that there are dragons in it, but you won't accept that there's a black hobbit in there or something like that. You're a racist, you're a bigot, and so on and so forth. To which I would say, look, by that same logic, I take it you wouldn't have a problem if a white guy was cast as Black Panther. I take it you wouldn't have a problem if a white guy was cast as Aladdin. No, of course those people would have a problem with that. And I'd agree with them because context. If a story is based on a certain region of the world, logically the people in that story are going to reflect that region of the world. But that's a whole different topic, and believe me, with how often the cast of Rings of Power is pulling out the race card, with how often they're calling fans bigots, believe me, I'll be talking about this topic again. But this quote from Lenny Henry, he says, "Of course if you go back, there's going to be that thing that prevails because the books don't say, although some of the characters are described as hard-skinned and darker in complexion. Yes, some characters were, but I think they meant more like they were tan. But most importantly, he says, but that was then, this is now, and we're telling the story now." And this is the sort of attitude that pisses Lord of the Rings fans off. And they're rightly pissed off. Because these people on Rings of Power, their attitude is, Lord of the Rings belongs to us now and we can do whatever we want with it. We don't have to follow Tolkien, we don't have to respect Tolkien, which Amazon never had any intention of following Tolkien's work. Their intention was to revise Tolkien's work. Their intention was to inject their ideology into Lord of the Rings. And the attitude from people like Lenny Henry here is, well, if you fans don't like it, that's too bad. The story belongs to us now. And then there's one other little quote here from Entertainment Weekly where they talk about the region of Rhûn. And J.D. Payne here says, "Rhûn is this blank check that Tolkien has given us to go somewhere that's never been depicted before." Tolkien has given us a blank check apparently. Tolkien has been dead for 50 years, 51 years. Unless he's talking about Simon Tolkien, which, if you want to say that Simon Tolkien has completely sold out the Tolkien estate, you go right ahead and make that argument. But they use the phrase blank check here, meaning we have freedom to create our own story essentially. And just earlier, they're talking about the Second Age, saying it's not a fixed target, there's an enormous amount of room for creation and improv within a loose framework, meaning we have the freedom here to be able to create our own story. Because the Second Age, it's a little more open-ended, it's not quite as detailed, so we have the ability to fill in the blanks and we have the ability to inject whatever we want into somebody else's work, into Tolkien's work. And with this, they're going to try and come up with the novel Tolkien never wrote. I mean, there's a reason why Lord of the Rings fans are so pissed off at Amazon, and they are rightly pissed off at Amazon. Because from the moment they got their hands on Lord of the Rings, Amazon's had this attitude of, this is ours now, we can do whatever we want, we can create our own story within somebody else's world, and we can do a better job than the actual creator himself, even though that creator is maybe the greatest author to ever live. And that author and his world has an enormous fan base to begin with. And he had an enormous fan base well before you came along with your show. I mean, if you ask me, one problem with Hollywood in general is the people there today, they have no respect for anything that came before them. They really don't. And Amazon and their attitude towards Lord of the Rings, that's a pretty good example of that. They do not respect Tolkien, they do not respect Lord of the Rings, they do not respect Lord of the Rings fans. They never had any intention of respecting Lord of the Rings. Their intention from the beginning was to revise Lord of the Rings and to pervert it with their woke ideology. And the thing about it that pisses off a Lord of the Rings fan like myself is that, we knew this was coming years in advance. We've been seeing one franchise after another being perverted, being vandalized, Star Wars being one of them, Marvel, Star Trek, Doctor Who. I mean, there's a long list. And because of that, we basically knew exactly what was going to be done to Lord of the Rings with this show. And the final product itself, Season 1 for Rings of Power, not only was it exactly what we thought it would be, it was worse. It was fan fiction written by people who were not actual fans. Amazon made all kinds of changes to Tolkien's lore. They injected all kinds of stuff that had no place in Middle-earth. And when Lord of the Rings fans rightly criticized the show, the people at Amazon, because it was their intention to destroy Lord of the Rings, instead of listening to the fans, they of course went on to attack Lord of the Rings fans instead. And the end result was perhaps the biggest flop ever created. A flop that nearly 2/3 of the audience didn't even bother to watch until the end of the season. What kind of an audience will Season 2 have? Will there even be an audience for Season 2? I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Everyone, I hope you enjoy this video and I'll see you next time. Take care until then.